All right, folks, so we are going to be going over two additional types of textures that are combined in your material to compose a full and complete material for an object. So we've primarily considered just what does this thing look like? And that is what we would typically consider to be the color channel. You know, is it blue? Is it red? Does it have logos on it? Like these kind of things, right? So that is the province of our color channel. But now we're going to be altering and improving that material by adding two other types of textures that define other sort of parameters of this material. So the first one is called a bump map. And bump maps govern how rough or smooth a particular surface appears. So again, if our color channel is like logos and is it blue and that kind of stuff, this is deciding if it's bumpy or smooth. Now, bump maps don't have color information. They are grayscale, as are the next type of texture we're going to be learning about. But a bump map is unique in that it is actually centered when it comes to grayscale in the middle of the color spectrum or the brightness spectrum, in that it starts at 50% gray. And looking at the example here, basically what it's telling you is that anything brighter than 50% gray will appear as though it is raising the surface, and anything lower than 50% gray will appear like it is carving into the surface. So we have an example of that down on the second page, where we have this image, this drawing a student made me many years ago of Diva, which should be obvious because it's Diva and Overwatch isn't relevant. But you can see this is just the drawing applied as a color channel on the plane. And then here, after running our process over the image, it created for me this bump map that captures some of the grain detail from the paper. So how do we do that? So if I am in, well, I'll go to the Photoshop stuff in a second. First, I'm going to get our example project set up. So I have provided for you folks on Classroom a project for texturing 3 and 4, which is why it says texturing 34. So it's texturing 3 and 4. And so here's our project folder. Hopefully you folks are comfortable now with when you get a folder, because Google Classroom is kind of goofy about it. You have to open it in a new tab, then you can hit the download button. It's going to put that into my downloads. If I open up on Finder and go to my downloads, there it is. So I just double click it to open up the zip file, and there we have it. Texturing 3.4, block bump spec. So you're going to be using the same project folder for both of the lessons, which in this video are combined. So if I go back to Maya now, I'm on the home page. The first thing that we need to do is tell Maya, yet again, that we are working in a project. So I'm going to set my project, go find my project. It's in my downloads. You folks might need to go to your name and then go to downloads. But then I'm looking for it. Boom, text 3.4, block bump spec, set. And then that way when I hit open, there it is. Boom. So here's what I've provided to you. You have this Cinderblock, which I already did the UV mapping for, and I already assigned a basic blend material that in the color channel, I assigned our basic Cinderblock texture. This is a tileable texture, so it just scales infinitely. And that file, because it's going into Maya as a texture, is living in my source images folder of my project. And that brings us to making our bump map. So if I am processing this tileable texture into a bump map, first I we'll open it in Photoshop. So here is my color texture completed, which we didn't have to do anything to. I gave it to you. Now, when you're producing a bump map, if there are multiple layers that you are working with, you will need to run this filter multiple times. However, for our purposes, we just got the one layer because we have our completed color map that we're going to apply this filter to the whole thing. So let's take a look at our bump map notes. When we are creating our bump map, we are concerned with using one filter, which is called the high pass filter. Now, that filter is going to take our image and it is going to heavily compress the middle tones of our image. So any of that stuff that would be like between your 10 and 90% grays, and really filter that stuff out by compressing it down to 50% gray. Now, the reason it's doing that is because 50% gray is neutral. It just means that there's no change to the appearance of your model, right? So if I look at my Cinderblock, it is still very flat, right? Very flat, very smooth. This should look rocky. It is technically a rock, right? Or composed of rocks. So that's what we want to add in. So we want to use our high pass and just leave a little bit of darker tones that might look like it's been, got dents in it, and a little bit of our lighter tones, which will make it look like it's a little bumpy and rough. So that's why we're using our high pass. So filter, other, and then high pass. There we go. Boom. Now, we want to keep the radius on this low, which means that we're compressing out a lot of the data, a lot of the information about our, middle grays and that kind of stuff. So the higher you have the radius, the more bumpy your bump map. So we don't want to go too crazy. So I'll do 1.5 for this and hit OK. And then that's it. Once you've completed your high pass, and if you have multiple layers, you might need to do this multiple times on each of the layers, but that's all you have to do, right, is add the high pass filter in most instances, as you will see with the arcade cabinet next week. So that's it for making our bump map. We're going to save a copy, and we want to make sure this one goes into that same source images folder where our base texture is. But here's the unique part. So you don't need to worry about putting your name on the textures because of how you're going to submit this. But we do need to denote that this is a different version of our Cinderblock texture. So I'm going to add hyphen or underscore B as in bump, because this is our bump map version of the Cinderblock texture. Format as JPEG is okay for what we are doing in class, and hit OK. And that's that. So I'll go ahead and close this now. I don't need to save the PSD. Now I'm back in Maya. So we have our object that already has a material on it. So I'm going to hold down right click and go to Material Attributes. That should bring you to your material. It might drop you on one of these other tabs. Just look for the one labeled brick. And then, so we already assigned our color. You'll see one channel labeled here, bump mapping. And I will assign a file to that. Now, when you assign a file to the bump mapping node, it attaches this bump map controller that allows us to, we can tweak how expressive our bump map is. We're not going to worry about that today. What you need to know today is that bump value. You can see it's got this highlighted part here, and there's a little arrow. That is where your texture lives. So I'll click through to the bump value, and here it's waiting for me to assign my texture. When I click my folder, because my project is set, I can see Cinderblock texture B, open. And so now you can see how rough and coarse this object is. You can also see how uniform the shine is as I go across the top. You can see that that sheen going across it. So that's the next thing that we're going to need to cover. Now, the other thing I would point out is that this is one of those things where you have to be very thoughtful about what distance the player is going to get to this object, right? So this looks really rough. If I go zoom in, like this looks really crazy. There's a lot of detail here, but in reality, players aren't getting much closer than this. So if they walk around, they might see just some of this subtlety. They're not going to see all of this, right? So you just have to be thoughtful about that kind of stuff when you're making your map. Is it achieving what you expect it to achieve based on what the player is going to see? So that is it on bump mapping. So again, bump mapping is what we use to define the roughness and bumpiness, it's right there in the name, of our material. So let's move forward to the final texture that we use to define our material. So this is where I would say to those watching me record this live, we are now on the new stuff, which is covering specular maps. So specular maps, or spec maps, as they are commonly called, define shininess. So is something shiny or is it dull? So together, color defines what does it look like, bump defines how rough or smooth the surface is of the material, and specular color defines how shiny or dull a particular material appears. Now, before we talk about spec maps and what they entail, I do want to point out something that we've sort of glossed over as we've been going throughout the year, which is blends and Lamberts. So those are two types of materials that we have used this year. And the guiding principle has basically been that Lamberts are not shiny, while blends are shiny. Now, for our purposes, I mean, that is still true, but for our purposes, what's important is that Lamberts, you cannot control the shininess because they do not have specular color, whereas a blend does have shininess and therefore does have a channel for specular color down here. And that is where our texture will be assigned when we complete it. So blends have specular. What is specular? It is, again, a grayscale texture, so black and white info, but as opposed to starting from the middle, like the bump map, and then you either raise or lower from the default, this is much more direct. If it's black, it's not shiny, and the closer to white, the shinier it gets. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, our spec maps take 2 steps to prepare, and also you do have to be at least a little thoughtful about the one actual step. The desaturate step doesn't really count because you're just slapping a filter on it. You don't have to think about it. But levels, when you get to the levels portion, you do have to think about what is the outcome that I am looking for, because only you know, or will know, not the computer, what it is that you're actually texturing and whether or not that thing is shiny. So when I want to produce a spec map, a common mistake is that people will produce it from the bump map. No. When you go to produce your spec map, you are again starting from the base color texture. So you're again starting from its color texture and producing another variation of the base color texture. So let's throw this into Photoshop again. So I know this looks very gray, but this is where I'll point out it actually has a subtle amount of brown on it because it is dirty. So that's why always our first step is to remove any color info that is in our document. So just under Image, Adjustments, Desaturate, boom, took out the brown. Again, if you have multiple layers, which in this case we don't, you might have to run that on multiple layers. Okay. Now, I can add my levels. Now, this is the exact same levels adjustment layer that we used on our face swaps, but we're going to use it for different stuff this time. So this time we're going to use it to adjust our color channel to more represent how, or a color texture to more represent how the specular channel should appear. So I don't know about y'all, but typically the rocks that I see are not particularly shiny unless they have been polished to be such, right? Typically your rocks are dirty and dusty and they don't reflect a lot of light. Now here's where I will say though, knowing how a cinder block is constructed, it is a slurry of dirt and small tiny rocks. And some of those rocks might be smooth enough to reflect some light. So we will let the levels reveal, where those pixels and those little tiny specks might be in this texture, right? So, but what I'm saying is, by and large, this texture should be very dark, right? Because rocks are not particularly shiny. But I'm also going to bring in my pure white and bring it closer, and you'll see how that brightens up a bunch of specks in here. And then I'm going to move my middle gray, again, closer to the white tab. That will introduce back in more darker tones and leave me with something. Let's go a little bit more back here with the pure white. Leave us with something more like this, right? So primarily dark, looks very much like stars, to be real with you, right? So most of it is dark, and then there are some parts that are catching the light, right? So I like that. That looks good. Again, we're going to save a copy, JPEG, in my source images. This time, instead of -B for bump, we will go -S as in specular, and save that out as well. So like I said, on our material, so I'm in object mode, select the object, let's go to material attributes. Under your material, you are looking under the specular shading for specular color. Go ahead and attach, click the little checkered box for the channel for specular color, attach a file again, and then now, again, when we hit that folder, we should see our newly created specular texture. And so before actually I hit and apply it, let me go up here so you folks can see, right? So look at how the sheen, as I roll back and forth on the top of the rock. It's really tough for you guys to see on my screen. I apologize. You'll see it on your end. But now I'll apply the specular, open, and now you can see when I go around, far less shininess, far less highlights. It's really just picking up in these brighter areas. You can sort of see like right here, little specks going throughout, little spider webs, right? So again, our players are only going to see this brick from like out here too. So doesn't need to be a science. But that is how you produce a bump and a spec map from your completed color. Again, the major things that will continue to become or more tedious or take more time as we continue this stuff is not necessarily the process of making things, you know, desaturated and using the levels, but if you have multiple layers, right, you might have to do these steps a couple of times to completely transition the color channel or the color texture into a spec map and or a bump map, right? So you might just have to repeat those same two steps a couple of times. But that's all it takes to complete your Cinderblock. Once you have on the material all three of the textures connected to it, and again, those textures should be living inside the source images, appropriately named either hyphen or underscore B and S, right? So I'm done with this. I'll go ahead and save it. Make sure it's saved. And then when you go to submit, To give it back to me, you're going to take that folder that you just completed work in, which is this one, and compress it. And then this is the file that you will need to appropriately name before you send it to me. So you can either right click and hit rename, or if you have it selected, you can hit the enter key, the return, and then, whoops, hold on. Yeah, I know. Enter, and it'll highlight the name, and then you can give it the appropriate name, 357, whichever period you're in, Meyer, and then this can be block. Boom. And so this zip file that encloses this whole project folder, so this zip file includes your newly created textures. This is what you're going to give me on Classroom. All right, folks, that is how you produce your not so shiny but very rough Cinderblock. Thanks for watching.